The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the courthouse steps. The air was crisp, but a tension hung in the atmosphere, thick enough to cut through the calm. People milled about, unaware that their routine day was about to take an unexpected turn. Among them was a young black woman, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, her confident stride a reflection of her years of hard work and dedication to justice. She carried a black leather briefcase in one hand, her other hand casually brushing the curls away from her face as the wind picked up. The courthouse was familiar to her, a second home, in a way, but today would be different. Today, she would be met with something she had not anticipated. Across the street, a police officer leaned against his patrol car, scanning the bustling scene with a stern expression. His uniform was neatly pressed, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. The officer's eyes narrowed as they landed on the woman approaching the courthouse. Something about her presence seemed to set him on edge. She didn't fit the image he expected for someone walking into that building, and his preconceived notions clouded his judgment. The officer stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the pavement. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his voice firm but devoid of friendliness. The woman paused, her brow furrowing slightly. She wasn't a stranger to being stopped, questioned, or judged based on appearances alone, but each time it happened, a familiar frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior. "Yes, officer?" she responded evenly, keeping her tone polite but measured. "Can I see some ID?" he asked, his hand resting on the holster of his belt not as a threat, but as an assertion of authority. "What's your business here?" Her gaze held his without flinching. "I'm heading to work," she replied. "Is there a problem?" The officer's expression hardened. "Work? You a paralegal or something?" he questioned, suspicion dripping from every word. "No," she answered firmly. "I'm a lawyer." The officer's scoff was audible. "A lawyer? You sure about that?" His disbelief was palpable, as though the very idea of a black woman in such a role challenged his understanding of the world. The woman remained calm, but her grip on the handle of her briefcase tightened. "Quite sure," she said, unwilling to let his skepticism rattle her. "You got proof of that?" he pressed, clearly not ready to back down. Without a word, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sleek leather card holder. She retrieved a business card and handed it to him. The officer glanced at it but seemed unconvinced. "Where'd you go to law school?" he asked, his tone still loaded with doubt. She arched a brow. "Is this an interrogation, or are you genuinely interested in my academic background?" The sarcasm in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. "Look, ma'am," the officer said, clearly irritated now, "I'm just doing my job. We've had reports of suspicious individuals around here, and I'm making sure everything checks out." "Suspicious individuals?" she echoed. "Do I fit that description somehow?" Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that he chose to ignore. "Just need to verify, that's all," he muttered, glancing around as though seeking backup for his unjustified actions. The bystanders nearby began to notice the exchange, their eyes shifting between the officer and the woman. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and tension mounted as the officer's behavior became more apparent. "I've shown you my credentials," the woman said, her voice steady. "If that's not enough, perhaps you should call your superior." "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped, his face flushing with anger. "I'm not getting smart," she replied calmly. "I'm simply asking that you treat me with the same respect you would extend to anyone else." Before he could respond, a uniformed court security officer approached, his gaze flickering between them. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone neutral but authoritative. "No problem," the woman said firmly. "Just a misunderstanding." The police officer looked like he wanted to argue but held his tongue. The court officer nodded politely to the woman. "They're waiting for you inside, Judge," he said respectfully. A stunned silence fell over the street. The police officer's face turned a deep shade of red as the weight of the revelation sank in. He had just confronted and questioned a judge, the very person who would be presiding over cases in that courthouse today. The woman gave the officer one last measured look. "I trust we won't have any more misunderstandings," she said coolly, before turning and walking confidently up the courthouse steps. Behind her, the officer stood frozen, the full impact of his mistake dawning on him. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as they processed what had just happened, a stark reminder of assumptions made and the consequences of unchecked biases. But inside the courthouse, the day was just beginning. And for the officer, this morning would be one he would never forget. Little did he know, this was just the start of a lesson far bigger than he had bargained for. The courthouse doors shut behind her, muffling the whispers from the street. The quiet hum of conversations echoed through the marble halls, heels tapping against the polished floor. Despite the tense exchange outside, her composure never wavered. She knew moments like that would come, had come before, and would likely come again. But she had worked too hard to let them define her. Her path to becoming a judge had been anything but easy. Growing up, she had witnessed injustice firsthand. It had fueled her determination to pursue a career in law, despite the obstacles stacked high against her. The long nights of study, countless cases, and battles in courtrooms where her presence was often questioned or dismissed, it all led to this day, standing tall in a place of authority few expected her to hold. As she moved toward her chambers, familiar faces greeted her with nods of respect, though some carried curious glances. Word traveled fast, and she knew by now the scene outside had likely made its way inside. Still, she kept her head high, not allowing the weight of their stares to slow her pace. Her position demanded focus and strength, and she had plenty of both. Her clerk met her at the office door, holding a thick stack of case files. "Busy docket today," he said with a sympathetic smile. "I wouldn't expect anything less," she replied, taking the files from him. "Anything I need to be aware of before we start?" "There's one case that stirred up some interest," he said carefully. "It involves a local community leader and a high-profile business accused of discriminatory practices." "Could get heated." She nodded thoughtfully. Cases like that were never simple. They carried the weight of public opinion and drew scrutiny from every angle. But her job wasn't about pleasing anyone, it was about justice. "Thanks for the heads up," she said, stepping into her chambers. The room was simple but elegant, books lining the shelves and framed photos from her journey displayed on the walls. Each one told a story, moments of triumph and challenge that shaped her into who she was today. She sat down at her desk, the noise of the world fading into the background as she reviewed the case notes. The accusations were serious, and the evidence presented by both sides would need careful examination. She read each line carefully, absorbing every detail, preparing herself for what was sure to be a contentious hearing. A knock at the door pulled her from her focus. "Come in," she called, expecting her clerk again. Instead, one of her longtime colleagues entered. His expression was one of cautious concern. "Heard about what happened outside," he said without preamble. "I'm sure everyone has," she responded, leaning back in her chair. "People talk," he said, shrugging. "But for what it's worth, I think you handled it with grace." "Thank you," she replied. "But it's just another reminder of the assumptions people make." "Unfortunately, yeah," he agreed, his tone somber. "But you're setting a standard here. People notice, even if they don't always say it." She appreciated his support but didn't dwell on it. "I have a docket full of cases to get through today," she said, steering the conversation back to work. "I'd better get to it." He nodded, understanding her need to keep moving forward. "If you need anything, let me know." "I will." "Thanks." As he left, she took a deep breath and focused her mind. The challenges outside the courtroom would always exist, but inside, the rules were clear, and justice was the goal. That clarity was something she relied on. The morning passed quickly, case after case moving through her courtroom. Each one required careful attention and thoughtful rulings, but she handled them with the calm authority that had earned her respect over the years. The weight of the robe she wore was never lost on her, but it was a weight she carried proudly. When the high-profile case finally arrived on the docket, the courtroom filled with spectators, reporters, and representatives from both sides. The tension was palpable, but she maintained her steady demeanor. This was her space, and she controlled the tone within it. Both parties presented their arguments, their voices rising with passion as they laid out their points. Allegations flew, defenses were mounted, and the courtroom buzzed with energy. She listened carefully, never interrupting but making detailed notes, as the proceedings continued. As the hearing stretched on, the complexities of the case became more evident. It wasn't just about the specific incident at hand, it was about something deeper, something that struck at the heart of fairness and equality in the community. The weight of the decision she would have to make was heavy, but she welcomed the challenge. This was exactly why she had pursued this path, to stand in the face of such difficulties and ensure that truth and justice prevailed. When the day finally drew to a close, the courtroom emptied, and silence returned. She sat alone at her bench for a moment, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. The law was rarely black and white, and today had been a stark reminder of the gray areas that demanded careful navigation. Before leaving her chambers, she took one last look at the files spread across her desk. The case wasn't over yet, and there was still much to consider. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of peace, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve justice. As she gathered her things to leave, her thoughts drifted briefly back to the officer from that morning. His assumptions had been clear, but so had her message: never judge a book by its cover. The courthouse was a place for truth, and she intended to ensure that truth was always heard, no matter who tried to silence it. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The quiet hum of the courthouse dimmed as the day stretched into the late afternoon. The sun outside had shifted, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Most of the morning crowd had dispersed, but for those still lingering, the tension remained thick. Eyes stayed glued to courtroom doors, reporters quietly murmured updates into phones, and a buzz of anticipation hung in the air. Everyone knew this case wasn't just another dispute. It symbolized something much larger, a community's cry for fairness clashing against entrenched powers unwilling to bend. Inside, the judge sat at her desk reviewing the final notes of testimony given earlier. The evidence was layered, arguments sharp and biting, but clear answers were elusive. Both sides had painted vastly different pictures, each equally determined to sway the court's judgment. And then there were the whispers, hints that certain forces had attempted to pressure witnesses and manipulate outcomes before the trial even began. She knew these allegations needed to be carefully considered, but proving them within the boundaries of the law was another challenge altogether. Her role required restraint and objectivity, but beneath the surface, her frustration simmered. Years in the courtroom had taught her to keep emotions controlled, but there was no denying the personal weight this particular case carried. Her clerk knocked softly before stepping in. "Judge, both parties are ready to reconvene," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. She nodded, standing and straightening her robes. "Let's finish this." When she walked into the courtroom, all eyes turned to her. The silence was almost deafening as she took her seat at the bench, her expression calm but resolute. The representatives from the high-profile business sat stiffly at one table, their legal team exchanging quick glances as they shuffled papers. Across from them sat the community leader, a man who had become a beacon of hope for many in the room. His supporters filled the gallery, their faces etched with quiet determination. "Before we proceed," the judge began, her voice clear and firm, "I want to remind everyone here that this is a court of law. Emotions may run high, but order will be maintained. Disruptions will not be tolerated. We are here to seek truth and justice, nothing more, nothing less." The room remained still, her words settling over the crowd like a heavy blanket. With a nod, she gestured for the proceedings to continue. The defense called its final witness, a polished spokesperson for the business in question. His testimony was smooth, his words carefully chosen to cast doubt on the claims made by the community leader. He spoke of company values, policies that supposedly fostered inclusion and fairness, and internal reviews that found no wrongdoing. His confidence never wavered, but the judge's sharp gaze caught every subtle deflection, every evasion. When cross-examination began, the tension in the room thickened. The community leader's lawyer wasted no time challenging inconsistencies, pressing the witness on overlooked details and questionable decisions. The verbal sparring grew intense, each side refusing to yield ground. The stakes were clear: reputation, livelihoods, and a community's faith in the justice system all hung in the balance. As the exchange continued, the judge kept her composure, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the officer from that morning. His assumptions about her mirrored the very prejudices now under scrutiny in this case. The parallels weren't lost on her, and they only strengthened her resolve to see this case through to its rightful conclusion. When the final arguments were made, the courtroom fell into a hushed anticipation. The air seemed charged, every person bracing for what would come next. But instead of delivering her judgment immediately, the judge did what few expected. She called for an additional review of certain evidence and subpoenaed witnesses previously withheld from testimony. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The move was bold, signaling that the case was far from over and suggesting there were truths yet to be uncovered. Her decision wasn't made lightly, but justice demanded thoroughness, and she wasn't one to be swayed by pressure or appearances. As the courtroom emptied for the day, reporters scrambled to relay the latest twist, and spectators buzzed with speculation. The community leader's supporters expressed cautious optimism, while the defense huddled together, visibly shaken by the unexpected turn. In her chambers, the judge sat quietly, the weight of the case still heavy in the air. She knew tomorrow would bring even greater challenges, the pressure mounting with every passing hour. But she also knew that standing firm in the face of adversity was what defined true justice. Outside, the streets were dim with fading light, but inside her mind, a fire burned bright. The truth was out there, waiting to be found, and she was determined to uncover it no matter who tried to stand in her way. The courtroom lights dimmed as dusk settled outside, but the tension from the day lingered in the air. The judge sat at her desk, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of a case file. Despite the temporary silence, her mind was far from quiet. The decision to reopen parts of the case had been necessary, but she knew it would provoke backlash. High-profile cases had a way of attracting trouble, and this one was already a boiling pot. Her clerk knocked softly and entered. "Judge, there's something you need to see." He handed over a sealed envelope, his brow furrowed in concern. She opened it carefully, her eyes narrowing as she read the contents. Anonymous tips weren't uncommon in high-stakes cases, but this one was different. It accused key witnesses of being bribed and alleged that evidence had been tampered with before the trial began. The claim was serious, and if proven true, it would upend the case entirely. But without proof, it was little more than an accusation hanging in the balance. The judge set the letter down, her resolve tightening. The timing felt calculated. Someone wanted her to react impulsively, to undermine her credibility or sway her judgment. But if there was even a grain of truth in the claim, it needed to be investigated thoroughly and discreetly. Justice demanded that no stone be left unturned. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with renewed energy. News of the case reopening had spread quickly, and speculation was rampant. Reporters lined the steps outside, cameras flashing as attorneys and witnesses arrived. Whispers of conspiracy theories and hidden agendas filled the air, but the judge blocked it all out, her focus locked solely on the truth. Inside the courtroom, tensions flared as attorneys exchanged heated words over the new developments. The defense vehemently objected to any suggestion of misconduct, while the community leader's legal team demanded a thorough investigation. The atmosphere was charged, and the judge had to raise her voice to restore order. "This court will not entertain baseless accusations," she declared firmly. However, if there is credible evidence that any party acted improperly, it will be addressed fully and appropriately. Until then, I expect both sides to conduct themselves professionally and respectfully." Her words settled the immediate chaos, but the unease lingered beneath the surface. The case had already been contentious, but now it teetered on the edge of chaos. Every decision she made would be scrutinized, every word dissected by both supporters and skeptics. As the day progressed, the clerk quietly handed the judge another update. Investigators had begun looking into the tip from the letter and uncovered preliminary evidence suggesting a possible connection between certain defense witnesses and unexplained financial transactions. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to warrant deeper inquiry. When court reconvened, the judge remained composed, but the weight of the revelation loomed large. The defense attorney stood, his voice edged with frustration as he demanded the source of the information. "We will not allow this court to be swayed by anonymous accusations without evidence," he argued. "This is a clear attempt to derail the case and unfairly prejudice my client." The judge met his gaze steadily. "The court has a duty to investigate any credible claims that may impact the integrity of these proceedings. I assure you, no decision will be made without substantial evidence. This court remains impartial and committed to justice." The defense attorney pressed his lips into a thin line but said nothing more. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge called for a recess to allow further investigation. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, matching the growing intensity of the case. The judge returned to her chambers, her thoughts racing. She knew this wasn't just about one trial, it was about trust in the entire system. And someone out there was determined to shake that trust to its core. The stakes were higher than ever, and the path forward was anything but clear. But one thing was certain: this battle for justice was far from over, and the truth was waiting to be uncovered, no matter how deeply it had been buried. The courtroom felt heavier than ever as the final day of proceedings began. The air crackled with tension, every seat filled with spectators eager to witness what they sensed would be a pivotal conclusion. The judge took her place at the bench, her expression composed but resolute. She had spent countless hours reviewing new evidence and hearing additional testimonies. Every detail weighed on her mind, but clarity had finally emerged. As the attorneys delivered their closing arguments, the weight of the case hung over them all. The defense argued forcefully, claiming that recent accusations of bribery were fabricated to taint the company's reputation. Their lead counsel's voice was steady, but beads of sweat betrayed his nerves. Across from him, the community leader's lawyer spoke with calm determination, emphasizing the importance of justice for those who had been wronged. The courtroom remained silent except for their voices. Everyone was waiting for the judge to speak. When the judge finally addressed the room, her tone was measured but firm. She acknowledged the complexity of the case and the challenges that had surfaced throughout the trial. She spoke of fairness, accountability, and the need to protect the integrity of the judicial process. Her words held the weight of both authority and empathy. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge ruled in favor of the community, citing overwhelming evidence of misconduct and corporate deception. The gallery erupted in gasps and quiet applause before she raised a hand to restore order. The ruling sent shockwaves through both sides. Relief swept over the community supporters, while the defense team sat stunned, realizing their carefully constructed faade had crumbled. But just as the room began to settle, an unexpected turn shattered the air of finality. The judge's clerk stepped forward, whispering urgently in her ear. Her expression shifted, becoming more focused and severe. She turned back to the courtroom, her voice clear and resolute. "Before we adjourn, there is one more matter to address," she announced, the room holding its collective breath. "An ongoing investigation has uncovered conclusive evidence that multiple defense witnesses were, in fact, bribed to give false testimony. Additionally, records reveal attempts to intimidate other key witnesses." The defense attorney stood, attempting to object, but the judge's words cut through the chaos. "This court will not tolerate manipulation of justice. The individuals responsible will face immediate legal consequences. The revelation sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. The carefully constructed lies had not only fallen apart, they had been exposed for everyone to see. It was a victory not just for the community, but for truth itself. As the judge adjourned the session, the courtroom buzzed with emotion. Supporters embraced, their faces marked with joy and relief. Justice had prevailed, but it was the final twist that reminded everyone of just how fragile fairness could be when corruption seeped in. Back in her chambers, the judge reflected quietly. The fight had been long and arduous, but today was a reminder of why she took the bench in the first place, to stand unwavering in the pursuit of justice. This case would be remembered not just for its verdict but for the courage it took to see it through. Outside, the storm clouds that had lingered finally broke apart, sunlight streaming down onto the courthouse steps. The crowd moved with a renewed sense of hope, the shadow of injustice lifted. But even as the judge prepared to leave for the day, she knew one thing for certain: though this case had come to an end, the fight for truth and fairness was never truly over. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the energy lingered, thick with the aftermath of justice served and secrets laid bare. The judge remained seated for a moment, watching as families embraced and whispered words of relief. The truth had come to light, and justice had been upheld, but the journey to get here left deep marks on everyone involved. Cases like this didn't just test the law, they tested the people tasked with defending it. When the last person filed out, the silence was almost overwhelming. The judge leaned back in her chair, letting out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Despite the victory, there was no denying the toll this case had taken. Lives had been uprooted, reputations shattered, and painful truths exposed. Yet, there was hope woven into the day's events, hope that justice could prevail, even when the odds seemed impossible. Later that evening, as she walked through the courthouse doors, the golden hues of the setting sun painted the sky. The crowd outside had thinned, leaving only a few stragglers talking quietly amongst themselves. She nodded politely to the reporters who still hovered nearby, their cameras and microphones lowered in respect. For now, they seemed content to let the story speak for itself. One of the community members approached, a middle-aged man whose weary eyes carried both gratitude and grief. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice heavy with emotion. "It means everything to us that someone finally listened." The judge met his gaze, understanding the depth of those words. "I just did my job," she replied gently. "The courage you all showed is what made this possible." He gave a small, grateful smile before stepping back into the dwindling crowd. As the judge continued toward her car, she reflected on the quiet strength of those who fought for justice without power or influence. Their determination reminded her why she chose this path despite its challenges. In the following weeks, the consequences of the trial rippled through the city. Several executives from the corporation faced criminal charges for their roles in corruption and fraud. The community received long overdue compensation for the damage inflicted upon their neighborhood. And though the road to rebuilding was long, there was renewed faith that accountability was possible. The judge remained dedicated to her work, but this case stayed with her in ways others hadn't. It wasn't just about legal victories, it was about restoring trust, about people reclaiming their voices after being silenced for so long. Every time she passed the courthouse steps and saw someone standing tall with renewed confidence, she knew it was a reminder that justice wasn't abstract, it was real, lived, and fought for every day. One afternoon, as she prepared for another busy docket, her clerk entered with a warm smile. "Judge, there's someone here who wants to say thank you. Should I send them in?" Curious, she nodded. A young woman stepped into the room, someone the judge recognized from the trial. She had been one of the key voices in bringing the community's case forward, standing firm even when pressured to back down. "I just wanted to stop by," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a mix of strength and vulnerability. "To tell you that what you did, it changed things for us. For me." The judge gestured for her to sit. "It was your bravery that made the difference," she said sincerely. You stood up when it mattered most. The young woman nodded, her eyes shining with determination. But you listened. You saw us, even when others didn't. That's something I'll never forget. They spoke for a while longer, sharing reflections on the trial and the journey beyond it. As the woman left, the judge felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work was hard, often thankless, but moments like these reminded her that making a difference, no matter how small, was always worth it. Time moved forward, and the courthouse returned to its usual rhythm. New cases came and went, each with its challenges and triumphs. But the echoes of that particular trial lingered in the walls, a reminder that justice wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence and courage. Years later, as the judge prepared to retire, she reflected on the many lessons she'd learned throughout her career. The courtroom had taught her about human strength, resilience, and the enduring pursuit of truth. That one case had been a turning point, not just for the community but for herself as well. On her last day, the courtroom was filled with colleagues, former clients, and members of the community who had come to show their appreciation. The young woman who once stood nervously in front of the bench was now a respected advocate for social justice, her voice more powerful than ever. As speeches were made and farewells shared, the judge smiled warmly, knowing her journey had come full circle. She had witnessed the worst and best of humanity, but above all, she had seen hope rise where once there was despair. Stepping outside the courthouse for the final time, she felt the sun on her face and heard the familiar hum of the city. Life carried on, with all its challenges and possibilities. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better for every person who stood up and demanded justice. And that was enough. With quiet pride, she walked away, leaving behind a legacy of fairness, integrity, and the unwavering belief that truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find a way to rise.